Hey, good morning. Happy Monday. We've made it through another weekend and starting another week. There's something's come up lately that I think is worth talking about. So I'm going to start with this and just kind of talk away as we do this. And I've called this a Lord of the Flies show. So if you're not familiar with Lord of the Flies was a book by William Golding. It came out in the 50s about a group of young kids that were stranded on an island after a plane crash. They were the only survivors, and they had to try and fill adult roles, and that became very, very difficult for them. And this quote that I stuck in here: "We did everything adults would do. What went wrong?" I've had multiple conversations with parents over the last 2 or 3 weeks about their kids and the fact that they seem to be getting out of control, that they seem to be losing capacity to listen, follow rules, pay attention, stick with what they want to do. It's just become a real struggle for people. And I think that that's something that we really need to pay attention to. So um, uh, adolescence represents an inner emotional upheaval to begin with, the struggle between the eternal human wish to cling to the past and the equally powerful wish to get on with the future. And the adolescent brain likes excitement. The adolescent brain likes to take risks. The adolescent brain is looking for new experiences. And usually we've got enough other stuff going on that it's relatively easy for most kids to color within the lines most of the time. But because of all of the changes that we're going through right now, that's become increasingly difficult. It's difficult for parents to find enough things for their kids to do. It's difficult for kids to find enough things to do. And then they start looking for additional excitements. And like what their brain is supposed to be learning how to do are all of these things: balance short-term rewards with long-term goals, considering the future, making predictions, focusing attention, organizing thoughts and problem solving, forming strategies, inhibiting inappropriate behavior, uh, like learning how to manage what's going on in their world and in their heads. But when kids start to really get too much freedom, too much time on their hands, they start looking for more and more things to do. So I'm not going to show you this whole thing. I just want to skip up to
that compulsion for drugs which forces addicts to seek them out.
To this 8-minute piece here. And this is specifically about drugs, but it's also what goes on in the brain when kids start to get into the pattern of partying, being out with no rules, doing stuff that they're technically not really supposed to do. That causes a dopamine rush, it causes an adrenaline rush. And in addition to just looking at that whole brain developmental piece, I think it's really important that we look at what's going on inside the brain. And when we get too used to extra pleasures, extra excitement, normal stuff just doesn't seem to be as good anymore. So
what degree are you feeling craving desire for cocaine? 0 to 9. 5. Thank you.
Unlike Nora Volkov's experiments, no drug is actually taken. They are studying the power of thought alone.
So that's the little red thing. Where's my magic laser pointer here? Oh, it won't go on there for some reason. Okay, sorry. The little red piece is the amygdala. That's part of our brain that gets excited. And when it starts to get excited regularly, it starts to look for that reward again and again and again. And pretty soon, and it doesn't take very long, the normal stuff that was interesting, that was satisfying, that was pleasurable, just stops working. So if we look at a normal, this is a SPECT scan, a normal brain, the valleys and bumps are areas of more or less, like lighter areas are lots of activity, darker areas are less activity. That's a teen who's a regular cannabis user. And I was talking to one parent the other day, and they said, well, you know, maybe they're using something else, but I thought they were just using weed. And that just word really concerns me, because cannabis, marijuana is a strong drug, and it isn't a just. And so whether it's alcohol or whether it's cannabis or whether it's anything else, that causes some really fundamental changes in the brain's capacity to process stuff. And even if it is only, I'm trying to avoid the just word, only like going out and hanging out at parties, that becomes an excitement, that becomes a level of interest that is hard to match in other areas. And then because parts of the brain are used to being overstimulated, the parts that look like holes become areas that just aren't working well. And they're not really holes, they're just areas that aren't getting enough dopamine. But when we get used to too much stimulation on a regular basis, the normal stuff that we need to be able to be interested in just doesn't seem to work anymore. So I think the reason that I'm doing this is to just encourage people to slow things down a little bit, spend more time at home, spend more time doing normal stuff. And if there is any kind of drug use at all, get that out of the way for a while, because if there is active drug use, and you know, like I said to a parent last week, because they thought, well, I think it's only like 2 or 3 times a week. That's way too much. And so people need a break from that to try and get their brains back to normal. So we'll take a look at this. I can find my, there we are, sorry.
We're surrounded by some powerful ideas about the sort of things that will make us happy. We tend to think that really to deliver satisfaction, the pleasures we should aim for need to be rare. We've inherited a romantic suspicion of the ordinary, which is taken to be mediocre, dull, and uninspiring, and work with a corresponding assumption that things that are unique, hard to find, exotic, or unfamiliar are naturally fitted to delight us more. Then we want things to be expensive. We like economic endorsement. If something is cheap or free, it's a little harder to appreciate. The pineapple, for instance, dropped off a lot of people's wish list of fruit when its price fell from exorbitant, they used to cost the equivalent of hundreds of pounds, to unremarkable. Caviar continues to sound somehow more interesting than chicken eggs. Then we want things to be famous. In a fascinating experiment, a celebrated violinist once donned scruffy clothes and busked at a street corner and was largely ignored, though people would flock to the world's greatest concert halls to hear just the same man play just the same pieces. Lastly, we want things to be large scale. We're mostly focused on big schemes that we hope will deliver big kinds of enjoyment: marriage, career, travel, getting a new house. These approaches aren't entirely wrong, but unwittingly they collectively exhibit a vicious and unhelpful bias against the cheap, the easily available, the ordinary, the familiar, and the small scale. As a result, if someone says they've been on a trip to Belize by private jet, we automatically assume they had a better time than someone who went to the local park by bike. We imagine that visiting the Uffizi Gallery in Florence is always going to be nicer than reading a paperback novel in the back garden. A restaurant dinner at which lobster thermidor is served sounds a good deal more impressive than a supper of a cheese sandwich at home. It feels more normal that the highlight of a weekend should be a hang gliding lesson rather than a few minutes spent looking at the cloudy sky. It feels odd to suggest that a modest vase of lily of the valley, the cheapest bloom at many florists, might yield more satisfaction than a Van Gogh original. And yet, the paradoxical and cheering aspect of pleasure is how weird and promiscuous it can prove to be. It doesn't neatly collect in the most expensive boutiques. It can refuse to stick with us on fancy holidays. It's remarkably vulnerable to emotional trouble, sulks, and casual bad moods. A fight that began with a small disagreement about how to pronounce a word can end up destroying every benefit of a 5-star resort. A pleasure may look very minor: eating a fig, having a bath, whispering in bed in the dark, talking to a grandparent, or scanning through old photos of when you were a child. And yet, these pleasures can be anything but small. If properly grasped and elaborated upon, these sort of activities may be among the most moving and satisfying we can have. Appreciating what is to hand isn't a slacker's solution. It isn't an attack on ambition. But there's no point in chasing the future until and unless we are better at being more attuned to the modest moments and things that are presently already available to us. More fundamentally, the smallness of small pleasures isn't really an assessment of how much they have to offer us. It's a reflection of how many good things the world unfairly neglects. A small pleasure is a great pleasure in waiting. It's a great pleasure which has not yet received the collective acknowledgement it is due. Appreciating small pleasures means trusting our own responses a little more. We can't wait for everything that's lovely and charming to be approved by others before we allow ourselves to be enchanted. We need to follow the muted signals of our own brains and allow that we are onto something important, even though others may not yet be in agreement.
So, thank you. Put it here.
Really to deliver satisfaction, the suspicion of the order, the corresponding naturally fitted to delight us more. Then we want things to be expensive. We like economic endorsement.
Well, that's okay. I'm just going to do this then. There, back to me. So, I think what I'm asking you to do is, whether you're a teen that's watching this and starting to get bored, and remember, being bored is a choice, or whether you're a parent really struggling with trying to keep things contained, it really needs to become an important discussion about, okay, let's get back to the simple things. Let's enjoy what we've got. Let's work, let's work on this. And sometimes we need help for that. So, talk to somebody, get a hold of me, get a hold of one of the counselors at school if things are not working well in your family, because we don't have to be able to solve everything ourselves. But just, if things are starting to get out of control, let's really try to slow things down and get those brains back to being comfortable, being used to being happy with simple stuff. Okay, have a good day. Really, have a good day. Thank you.